Chapter 12, The Rise of the Modern Age, Part 4, Democracy as the Rising Ideal of American Politics. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, as we have just seen, America was developing its own new thoughts on the matter of society and how programs could be brought into play to make for a much better world. Interestingly, much of the American individualistic mindset found itself easily forming around this term that about this time was gaining great currency: democracy. Democracy in the American context was not socialist or even particularly Darwinist, as was the case generally in Europe. But it did have strong elements of Rousseauian utopianism in it, and it seemed also to be a natural fit to the spirit, the mood of America as it entered the 20th century. American democracy was built on the instinctive idea of the full sovereignty of the millions of individuals that made up American society. They alone as individuals were responsible for their futures. They alone governed their lives. They were truly members of a great democracy. Democracy or republic. Thus it was that with the arrival of the 20th century, Americans began more frequently to refer to their society as a democracy rather than a republic. Probably Americans thought that the two were the same thing. They were and are not the same thing. America is indeed a republic, just as the framers of our Constitution intended. America is not a democracy, nor has it ever been a democracy. Why the confusion? Rousseauian idealism. A big part of the confusion over the idea of democracy is that since the early part of the 20th century, high-minded Americans began to take on the old and well-failed mid-1700s idea of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that democracy is some kind of natural political condition of man. Natural in the sense that if it were not for the corruptions of a bad culture or a corrupt government, people everywhere would live freely, lovingly, on the basis of a distinctive instinct, a deeply instinctive desire to live freely in peaceful fellowship with each other as individuals. That is, they would live democratically. They needed no autocratic authority to force them into social compliance. They could live together freely, strictly on the basis of their own personal instincts towards social harmony. For Rousseau, the reason we did not find man presently living in such a state of natural bliss was because of the corrupting influence on human behavior of societies built on wealth and power. As we have just noted, Rousseau felt that the solution was to tear down the artificial structure of European civilization and go back to nature, where we would then live naturally in blissful harmony. So, according to Rousseau and most utopianist Western intellectuals since then, including a growing number of American progressivists and virtually all American hippies, democracy is supposed to be instinctive to man, and one day, through our evangelical efforts to spread democracy to the world, we would bring our world to a state of perpetual peace by having everyone living democratically, that is, freely. It was and is a beautiful utopianist dream. Man's self-serving instincts. But it was and is a dangerous dream because it is built on an entirely naive assumption about human nature. It is an idea built on a great illusion. Man is, by all natural instincts, self-preserving and self-promoting. This is how people start out life as babies, highly demanding of attention to their personal needs. Their survival demands that. The socialization of the individual. But that same sense of selfishness is vital to the process of socialization. Man is able to live or function socially only because he is taught, as he grows up, that by living in cooperation with others, he will actually improve the benefits he personally draws from life. Thus, as he matures, he is taught by social authority how to cooperate with larger society in order to draw its tremendous benefits for himself. The teaching process begins at an early age, the terrible twos, and his very first social context, that of the family, a family presided over by an authoritative mother and father. He then continues to learn through schooling to extend this realm of social self-interest by cultivating a deeper sense of social self-discipline. If any part of the process fails to take place, the individual will have a hard time coping with the demands of social life and will not know how to do adult and find a productive place in society. Tragically, he might even fall into what society terms criminal behavior. In short, the Rousseauian ideal, if actually undertaken, will result not in democracy, but in anarchy. Not the beautiful state of anarchy dreamed of, however, by the utopian anarchists. A reprise. The original intent of the American founding fathers. Concerned about popular tyranny. Indeed, it is important to note that the framers of the Constitution were definitely not intending to create a democracy. For whatever reasons, partly historical, remembering how the Athenian democracy had been manipulated by the sophist demagogues, who could move the gullible Athenians to support self-destructive policies and actions, partly Puritan, partly Aristotelian, they were not believers that pure democracy was possible or even desirable. The early Puritan understanding of man's inherent selfishness or sinfulness, and Aristotle's teaching about the susceptibility to tyranny of any kind of government, including democracies, made the framers very cautious about turning all power over directly to the people. Checks and balances. They had built on the developing British parliamentary system of the 1600s and 1700s, the idea that the French political philosopher Montesquieu had pointed out, and Madison reaffirmed in the Federalist Papers, that afforded all sorts of checks and balances against any one particular kind of political impulse, rule of one, of the few, or of the many, securing a dominant or controlling or tyrannical position in the governing program. Power was cautiously allotted to this and to that part of the governing system without it being concentrated in any one particular position. Power was purposely spread widely across all these varied political impulses to ensure that no power holder, not a presidential monarch, not a congressional oligarchy, not a democratic mob, could establish a controlling grip over the system. To allow that to happen would be to allow tyranny to develop. No, indeed, this was no democracy that they created, but instead was a mixed system designed to best serve the whole society, present and future, for hopefully a very long time. Representative government. Representative government, as close as they got to democracy, was really provided for originally only in the House of Representatives, where the citizens were allowed a direct vote for their representatives in Congress. The Senate was understood to represent the states and their governments. The 2 Senate seats each state was to receive generally being appointed by the state governors or elected by members of the state legislatures. The original Constitution did not specify how the states were to come up with their 2 senatorial representatives. In any case, the U.S. senators were not originally intended to be elected by the people. The 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, would change that. Likewise, the chief executive officer, the president, was not to be elected directly by the people, but by the states. Each state awarded special electors in the same number of their senators and representatives in Congress. These electors would be the ones who would elect the president. How the states were to choose their electors was originally left up to the states to decide. And the federal judges were not elected by the people, but were appointed by the president, subject to a confirming vote of the U.S. Senate. limited official or state government. Furthermore, the national officers were given only very limited jurisdiction. That is, they were permitted to govern only in very specific areas. All other government functions were left to the state legislatures as their exclusive right to perform. Thus, originally, America's national democracy was quite limited in scope and subject to the checks and balances of the other branches and levels of the federal government. That is, federal originally meaning the whole plan, including the huge governmental role reserved to the states as part of the federal system. The Constitution is, after all, originally an alliance of 13 independent states. It must be remembered that the government set up by the framers was actually a military political alliance among 13 independent-minded states, unifying them in the face of a threatening world outside of their own, such as the British wanting to come back to retake them one by one, or even by greedy French or Spanish monarchs hoping to do the same. It was never conceived as a government that would rule over the internal affairs of the 13 states, as the 10th Amendment states quite clearly. The framers neither desired nor needed such a government. They were very determined on that matter, having just gone through a huge war against the English King George III, who had in mind to bring the 13 colonies under his direct rule as their enlightened lord and master. And yet this would always be the temptation of the powerful, to bring the less enlightened ones of society under the better rule of their natural superiors. Such is always the temptation of the enlightened ones, who have fed themselves on the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Such self-awarded enlightenment is the worst of all human sins, for it gives the enlightened ones the false impression of being sacred and all-powerful like gods. The democratic impulse at the heart of American progressivism. And so it was that the original American caution concerning unchecked democracy began to be set aside in the early part of the 20th century. In part, this development was the outgrowth of the progressive movement as America became very self-critical of the many corruptions in American government and society, and always on the lookout for improved ways to bring to the surrounding society. The government as economic and social referee. Rather naturally, it was to the national government that reformers ultimately looked in the hope that wise legislators might remedy these social problems. And indeed, it did, at least to the extent of stepping into the game of laissez-faire capitalism in order to referee the behavior of capitalism's prime players in the marketplace, thus the government's trust-busting of the huge financial monopolies that had come into ownership of huge sectors of the American economy. This done to safeguard the lives of American workers and to inspect and enforce standards of quality that the industrial market and its products put forward for sale in the community. The primary system. The government also began to put pressure on urban bosses to be open and fair about how elections and political business were conducted in American cities. The party candidates for public office were usually selected behind the scenes by party bosses. But in a move, state by state, over a period starting in 1902 and involving all of the states by 1915, candidates for office came to be selected through the primary system, where the voters themselves were given the right to select, that is, vote for, the candidates of their parties. To this key democratic reform was added the idea of popular recall of corrupt political officials. And finally, to move urban government to work along more professional lines was added the idea of hiring a professional city manager who would be neutral in the realm of party politics and simply supervise the functions of urban government on scientific principles. And in early 1913, 2 new amendments to the American Constitution went into effect, ones designed to give both the voter and Congress new powers thus enhancing democracy, although these amendments would also lessen greatly the effect of the checks and balances of the original Constitution. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution, direct taxation. The 16th Amendment gave Congress the right to expand its ability to function on its own by allowing Congress to tax directly the incomes of Americans. This would give Washington a new independence of operation from the states, which were viewed as too dependent on party machines and thus supposedly by the progressives anyway, more susceptible than Washington to political corruption. Of course, the power to tax is, of course, a great power, and the progressives had just given the government in Washington extensive powers not previously possessed. What they did not realize is that they had not solved the problem of corruption, but had simply transferred the potential for that problem from the states to Washington, for they failed to understand that corruption always finds a path to wherever power is located. The 17th Amendment, popular election of senators. The 17th Amendment also diminished the power of states by democratizing the U.S. Senate, making it now a body of government officials directly elected by the people rather than directly by the states. Again, the supposition was that it would operate more responsibly if it were answerable directly to the people rather than to the states and their political machines. This was widely understood at the time to be an excellent idea, the idea of democratizing further the operation of American government. That is, discarding the suspicions of the original framers of the American Constitution, who held no particular form of government, including democracy, to be ideal. And perhaps it was, as long as the people themselves were sophisticated in their understanding of the process of national government. If they remained vigilant with a detailed following of national politics and were not easily manipulated by clever voices that could spin ideas and turn hearts easily. The progressivists were confident that a well-educated electorate, under proper guidance, namely that of the progressivists themselves, could meet all these high standards. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic idealist. Certainly the most important person to shift America to a full devotion of the democratic idealism that was finding its way into the heart of the progressivist movement was Woodrow Wilson. Princeton professor, 1890 to 1902, Princeton president, 1902 to 1910, governor of the state of New Jersey, 1911 to 1913, and finally, President of the United States, 1913 to 1921. He combined all the traits, positive and negative, of a democratic idealist. He detested corruption or imperfection of any kind in society, had very clear ideas of what needed to be done, had no patience for the art of compromise, and was very intolerant of anyone who did not support his views. His early years. Wilson was born to a Scots-Irish Protestant family, his father having moved from Ohio to the South to pastor Presbyterian churches in Georgia and South Carolina. Wilson was just 3 when the Civil War broke out, and his slave-owning father became a key leader in the Southern breakaway from the National Presbyterian Church. His father, indeed, would lead the Southern Presbyterian Church as its stated clerk from 1865 to 1898. After the war, Wilson lived in Columbia, South Carolina, where his father was a professor at the Columbia Theological Seminary. Schooling. Wilson's schooling started late, perhaps from a problem of dyslexia, but he disciplined himself to compensate and developed strong academic skills as a result. Wilson started his college studies at Davidson College in North Carolina, his father taking up a pastorate there in the meantime, but had to drop out because of illness. He transferred the next year to Princeton, taking up the study of political philosophy and history, becoming deeply involved in collegiate debate. After graduation from Princeton, he took up law studies, first at the University of Virginia, but again health issues forced him to return home to North Carolina. There he continued his law studies, took and passed the Georgia bar exam, but after a year of law practice found the work uninteresting and decided to pursue doctoral studies in political science and history at Johns Hopkins University. Doctoral studies. Here he wrote his doctoral dissertation, revealing himself to be a democratic idealist who could find no good reason for the American constitutional checks and balances system. In his doctoral dissertation, Congressional Government, 1885, he judged the checks and balances system as, we quote, manifestly a radical defect in our federal system, that it parcels out power and confuses responsibility as it does. The main purpose of the Convention of 1787 seems to have been to accomplish this grievous mistake. The literary theory of checks and balances is simply a consistent account of what our Constitution makers tried to do, and those checks and balances have proved mischievous just to the extent which they have succeeded in establishing themselves. This is from page 186 and 187. Wilson made it clear in his study that he preferred the parliamentary system of the British, which had a more responsible form of political authority in command of the political system. He viewed the American Constitution as terribly pre-modern, and its checks and balances system as formula designed merely to produce political stagnation and corruption. What modern constitutional government required, he believed, was a strong hand at the helm of state. In this, Wilson's thinking followed closely the line of other democratic idealists, including Marx and Lenin, who advocated revolutionary change to a system in which strong but enlightened leadership would serve as the people's advocate, thus qualifying it as very effectively democracy. The fact that this easily opened the doors to popular dictatorship somehow escaped the understanding of these political scientists. Professor Wilson. After marrying the very artistic Ellen Axon, daughter also of a Presbyterian minister, the Wilsons moved to New York for Wilson to teach history at Cornell University, 1886-1887, and then Bryn Mawr College, 1887-1888, then Connecticut Wesleyan University, until 1890, when he was offered the chair of jurisprudence and political economy at Princeton. Quote, democratic politics would work better under a greatly empowered national leader, unquote. By this time, he'd eased up a little in his negative view of the legacy of the Founding Fathers, but he never seemed to back down on his view that American politics should be more like the British parliamentary system in that it should be directly under the control of the national leader, through his command of the dominant political party, dedicated to supporting the high principles set forth by that leader. This is reported in his work, Constitutional Government of the United States, 1908. This lofty view of government by a principled leader would always remain at the heart of his idea of how politics should work. He himself eventually would attempt, as American president, to govern the country just from such a lofty position. He was, in fact, a strong advocate of an activist government empowered to correct the ills of society, and published a number of articles and books over the next dozen years, actually at the time quite well received in intellectual circles, advocating exactly just such a government. Princeton president. His writings had attracted the interest of other universities, the University of Illinois, 1892, and the University of Virginia in 1901, asking him to serve as their president, offers which he declined. But when Princeton asked to serve as their new president in 1902, he accepted. Taking up the position, he proved himself to be an active developer, programs, buildings, and endowments developing rapidly under his leadership. He also worked hard to broaden the religious view of Princeton from beyond mere Presbyterian theological conservatism and the student body from being a place for young gentlemen to glide through with a C average to moderately respectable diploma. He demanded more, much more of the school. But he found himself opposed by various faculty and board members in his reform efforts. A crisis developed because he just was not a person cut out to find a way to win people to his ideas through diplomacy. Wilson would not accept anything less than full compliance with his ideas of university reform. New Jersey governor. Thus his thoughts began to turn to the idea of public office. And New Jersey political bosses began to look on with interest in Wilson as someone they might want to run for the 1910 state race for governor. He agreed to run, and they agreed to get him nominated as the Democratic Party candidate for governor, which they easily delivered to Wilson. Thus he resigned his position as Princeton president in October, just shortly before the November elections. And in November, he easily won the election over his Republican rival. Now, as New Jersey governor, he was in a position to pursue political reform, exactly according to his own ideas of what needed to be done. He was bold and unyielding in his attack on the party bosses of New Jersey, the very ones who had brought him to power. He instituted the primary system, which allowed the ordinary voter to bypass the urban bosses in selecting electoral candidates themselves for public office, striking a blow for democracy. The 1912 election. Thus, after only a short term in office as governor, his work was recognized sufficiently for his name to be put forward as a possible Democratic presidential candidate for the 1912 national elections. After much campaigning for the office himself, plus some critical last-minute support from Bryan at the convention, and after 46 ballots, he was nominated for as presidential candidate by his Democratic Party. Wilson, elected U.S. president. There was little chance that this lofty Princeton professor turned New Jersey political reformer would ever be elected American president, except that Teddy Roosevelt's decision to run as a third-party candidate changed entirely the political landscape. As already noted, this action consequently split the large Republican Party electorate and allowed Wilson to win the presidency with a simple plurality, not a majority, of the votes. But the election also brought large Democratic Party majorities in both houses of Congress, thus helping the new president get much of his legislative program moved forward. As president, Wilson stuck closely to his strongly progressivist principles of low tariffs, taxes on the wealthy, and antitrust reforms in the banking and industrial world. He turned trust busting from congressional legislation to regulation by a new Federal Trade Commission, empowered to guard against the development of large trusts and monopolistic buyouts, which now were permitted only with federal approval. He moved quickly to reform the nation's erratic banking system, which suffered so easily from the panics that struck the nation at regular intervals, by setting up a Federal Reserve System to help expand or contract the nation's money supply in order to offset both inflations and deflations. By 1915, the new system was ready to go to work, just in time to help the nation face the troubles going on in Europe. But in the world of black-white relations, he proved himself to still be a Southerner at heart, calling for the segregation of government workplaces and facilities, claiming that segregation removed the possibilities of racial tensions affecting government work, although both Roosevelt and Taft undertook something of a similar policy. His re-election in 1916. Wilson campaigned on the basis of the many reform measures passed under his presidency, which seemed connected to an obvious prosperity that the nation was experiencing at the time, and the fact that he had artfully kept the nation out of the war going on in Europe, one that was clearly grinding down civilized life on that continent. But events would soon change that picture. But that story belongs in the next chapter.